Sorry about that. Okay, so got a case of severe butterfingers, huh? So you're about to hear a piece of propaganda, and it's interesting because it comes from Al Jazeera. And you'd think brown people would like brown people, but apparently somebody in control at Al Jazeera hates brown South Americans. So they hate the Venezuelan government. They hate the FARC and the ELN. Now, let me tell you something. All of these indigenous groups that have been fighting their governments. Okay, so maybe it's easier to explain to you. Venezuela is a country where the people have won. Okay, the vast majority of Venezuelans support themselves. Okay, and then there's a few people who were in control via the American government and American weapons and violence and thuggery. And they're a tiny minority. I mean, they may be 20%. And that would be everybody as far as you could see. I'd say they're more like 10 or 15%. They're probably equal to about the percentage of very white people in the country. They're the 1%. You know, they're the people who, just like in our country, you know, the ultra rich. You got the 0.1%, or 0.01% or whatever that are like mega rich, and then you got on until you get to like their thugs who are police and what have you, politicians and everything, which adds up in the United States to maybe between 20 and 25% of the entire population, and most of them would not support themselves. The 0.01%, then most of them would not, right, if they knew the truth. But the media and everything else. So Venezuela is a place where they've gotten control enough that the electorate isn't fooled, and when they have an election, it's pretty much a landslide. Just the 70 or 80% or 90% of the people vote for themselves, you know. And of course, the old guard, backed by the United States and still backed and still attempting to commit coups, you know, these riots and stuff. It's just a tiny minority out there trying to kill people. I mean, they can't stand being treated like everybody else in the country, you know. So they've got their companies and everything, and now that's been throttled. Not because anybody's taken away their companies from them or anything like that, except for the oil, which is the big one, right? But because nobody has to buy from them. Nobody has to put up with their bullshit anymore. You know, their media still exists, but nobody watches it, except for themselves. You know, they have the people have their own media now. So that's Venezuela. And unfortunately, Al Jazeera, for some reason, whether they're being paid a whole lot of money by some conservative, or because they're conservative, or because the person who picks and chooses the stories and decides what kind of stories to run is racist against other brown people. I mean, this is silly. So anyway, I don't know exactly why they do it, but here's a propaganda piece.
That will test the nation's commitment to a peace deal, which ended 52 years of fighting. So former FARC rebels are making their political debut after laying down their arms and converting to a peaceful movement. Now, FARC is guaranteed.
Now, let me tell you something. FARC and the people of Colombia are suffering under this agreement. There's been a whole bunch of killings by the government and their militias Uh, and this is what we fear in America, is that, you know, a government like Ronnie Rump, you know, Trump, will will turn a blind eye to these racist militias, and they'll start doing stuff just like what they're doing in Colombia. And I'll get to a piece about that probably on Telesur and cover that with this so that you have the truth. This is bullshit. Okay, now they're telling the truth about there being an agreement, and you know the ELN is not part of the agreement, but they've agreed not to strike first, at least while these elections are going on.
To win a minimum of 10 seats under the terms of the peace settlement, but many Colombians feel that former fighters.
So this is what 90% of Colombia looks like. I mean, white people just are, and they're mixed in. You know, there's white people have been raping the cuter, you know, indigenous girls for years. So there's a lot of white in the. It's a mix, but generally speaking, they're not white. They're not white. So, and the interesting thing about this is that the United States has always supported the white racist government who tries to do all the drug dealing, so what are called the cartels. But then every once in a while somebody who's more brown than white will get in control of the cartels, like I don't remember his name, but he made a big splash and everybody would know, and they ended up going in and murdering him. And he was a vicious, because there's no choice, right? I mean, if you're going to be a drug dealer in Colombia and eventually decide you don't, because you know what the white people did in Colombia. The white people are really at the top of the drug dealing, is they decided they didn't want to give him as much money for his side of the drug dealing, which was dealing with the farmers and bringing in the coca and processing the coca, you know. So they decided, it's just like here in the United States, the real drug dealers aren't prosecuted, just their competition. So you have that going on, and in fact, the government and the white people of Colombia were in charge of, you know, making all the money off the drug dealing. And the FARC decided that they weren't, you know, the FARC is out there in the countryside, so they could control the coca if they want to. And they decided that's exactly what they would do. They would take that away from the rich white people, even though for the most part the indigenous people and even the people who grow coca in Colombia don't believe that in doing drugs and selling drugs, but they just decided they wanted to take that money away from the rich Colombian government, and mainly, you know, the Mexicans tell me, because I have a lot of friends, and some of my friends are Mexican American, and they tell me about how they have a way of splitting up all these people, and there's whites, and I think the way they described it to me is there's like mixed whites and brown, indigenous, and then of course there's the very white. And the United States, and mainly Christian Americans, like evangelical Christians, of course support, and they do it through their thugs and their Bushes and their Trumps and however, you know. Okay, so let's get back to why this is propaganda on Al Jazeera. Let's watch some more.
Should be in prison for other than Congress. Alessandro Impesi joining us live from the capital, Bogota. So the FARC's participation.
So they're going to show right here a side of this that is like the 1%. They're going to let, even though the people of Colombia massively would not support these whites who are running the country, because they're only a small percentage of the population. Uh, for for their own reasons, Al Jazeera is going to run that side and show that side right now, like it had any support, or like it was any kind of popular or percentage of the population.
Obviously is a huge issue. They face an uphill battle. What does this all mean for them and for the...
Okay, now FARC and the indigenous people of Colombia, just like in Venezuela, do not face an uphill battle with the people of Colombia. And when you talk about voting, the reason that these people win in Colombia is because they don't let any of the indigenous people vote. They make it so that only their own people get to vote. So they make sure that the votes in the cities and where they're at, they make sure they get to vote. But the indigenous people, how they do it exactly, I don't know. You'd have to ask Jimmy Carter probably, because he knows. I'm sure he's aware of it, because he's in very, well, he's too old now, but there are groups who monitor how the elections are done, and in the United States they have very sophisticated ways of keeping minorities from voting, and fortunately in the United States, for them, there are a lot of white people. But in these countries where white people are a minority, how they manage it obviously has to be election fraud, right? And their media, and they're going to pretend like it's nothing of the sort, like it's all legit, and there's just no support for the FARC. That's what they're going to pretend like here, even though they haven't been able to get rid of the FARC in 50 years with constant military warfare upon the people of Colombia.
The peace deal implementation?
Well, Darine, entering legal politics was never going to be easy for the FARC after 50 years of conflict against the Colombian state. But I think that even them have been surprised by just how poisonous...
The Colombian state. You're talking about a small group of heavily armed by the United States thugs, and none of the people. And, sure, they're able to buy off the people in these cities where they're able to give them nice homes and nice lives. So they're able to buy those people off, just like in the United States. Conservatives buy off, sometimes as much as 50% of the people. That's how they win elections. But that's not the only way. Like I say, it's very sophisticated in the United States. It involves a lot of different strategies, the media, obviously voter suppression, also just tactics. Like, they took over the Democratic Party and then they run somebody like Schiller against Trump. That's a tactic. That keeps people, because nobody wants to vote for either one of them. So you end up with you don't end up with these landslides like you did with Obama in 2008. And Obama just fooled everybody into believing that he wasn't an establishment Democrat. We found out over the years he was. His skin couldn't fool people forever, being half black. His mama was actually whiter than my mama. Or as white anyway. Lily white. So, this is obviously a propaganda piece. And I see everything about Venezuela as propaganda out of Al Jazeera. And I have no idea who it is or why they're so avidly pro-American and pro-conservative.
The atmosphere surrounding these elections have been their candidates.
Anyway, this is going to be a bunch of nonsense. Okay, I'm warning you now.
Have been attacked threatened on social media. They've been pelted with tomatoes or stones during...
You're telling me that the FARC political leaders have been out and they've been pelted with stones and tomatoes, and if that ever happened, I have to tell you that's because the conservatives pay people to go do that. But I would bet you that 99% of the time when they're actually out in the countryside speaking to the people, they have an enormous... They have the same kind of support as Maduro has and Chavez had in Venezuela. I mean, amongst the 90% of the population, I mean, I could get on go to Wikipedia, you'll find out what the percentages are. And, I doubt that there are enough white people in any South American country to win elections. And, I hope the same thing happens in South America as happened in Africa. I was watching a piece the other day, probably on Al Jazeera, about black Americans who are going back to Africa. And that's because they can go to Africa and they can live in countries where they're treated like white people are treated in the United States, Canada, Australia, right? And I don't know if they're flocking back there, but it sounded like a lot of them were going, and it makes perfect sense. And in South Africa, where the white people pretended to be the vast majority of people all during their whole thing till it collapsed, now the land is about to be taken away from them, and it's not always white people, because they supported, or no, the white people didn't so much support as they bought off black people to join their side. So a lot of the land that's owned by black people in South Africa is owned by black people who got their land through being good to white people and supporting the apartheid government. And so now, of course, the South Africa's saying, nah, you guys took that land from regular old black people, and we're giving it back. And they will. In the next 5 or 10 years, they'll give all that land. They'll take all that land away from the black and white apartheid people and share it with the people, hopefully, who, well, I wouldn't even want them to give it back to the people who owned it before that, because land forever has been a ridiculous situation where people, like when the United States was formed, white people were allowed to go out and take all the land from the indigenous people. And so they ended up with vast tracts, and just as you would suspect, over time that's become an enormous power for white people in this country. They've been able over time, as the land became more and more valuable, until now it's like really becoming valuable. Even a little piece of land like I have, farmland in the middle of nowhere, is becoming, people want to build houses on it. It's only a few acres, but people are willing to pay. And that wasn't the case 10 years ago. It's just in the last 10 years I've noticed that these outlying areas have become immensely valuable to white people. They're spreading and covering it, and they want, a big piece of land and a big house. Anyway, so, and these things are all related, because those kind of things are going on in every country. Okay, and white people are doing those things in every country, and for sure in Colombia and Brazil, and probably a few other countries still in South America, you've got that problem. And, the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen not only Venezuela, but Peru and a few other places where they've demanded democracy. And once they get democracy, It's all over for the white people who've been taking advantage of everybody. Because democracies, true democracies, don't usually stand for the kind of class warfare that we have, like here in the United States, and in Colombia and Brazil and other places. So let's listen to more of this guy's bullshit.
Many campaign events, so much so that the FARC has decided to suspend their campaign a month ago, and their then presidential candidate Rodrigo Londoño, better known as Timoshenko, finally decided to end his campaign. However, it was also for health reasons, and the FARC has not been the only party that has suffered these kinds of attacks. It just show how angry Colombians are for the economic downturn, for the issue of corruption here. But for the FARC, as you were saying, since they indeed have guaranteed 10 seats.
So he mixes in a little bit of truth about corruption, which is always going on amongst these drug kingpins, these Medellin cartel types who are running the country. But what's he talking about? The FARC dropping out of the run for president? Well, we'll have to look into that, won't we? And I'll add that in here in a little bit.
The turnout will still be extremely important to legitimize their presence in Congress, and this will be very important for the implementation of the peace deal.
But I would say FARC already knows that they're going to be cheated at the polls.
The issue of peace, however important, is not the most present in the mind of those who are voting today. Corruption is probably the main theme, as we discovered.
And FARC wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for the vast majority of people in Colombia. Okay, if 50% of the people were white and they all supported the white drug dealers, kingpins, FARC probably wouldn't even exist. But they're more than that.
In our latest story. As Colombians gear up to renovate their Congress on Sunday, there's one issue on everybody's mind.
La corrupción sin duda es la corrupción.
Corruption, or corruption, is the biggest worry of voters rich and poor on the right or left of the political spectrum.
So already we're seeing, they're talking about corruption at the ballot box. That's why they keep showing pictures of the ballot boxes and people voting, because they know. You know, I mean, it's like everybody knows, but there's nothing anybody can do, because it's kind of half like the United States. You know, we know that there's some corruption at the ballot box, that there's election fraud, but there's not a lot we can do about it.
Colombian guerrilla war has long overshadowed illegal political practices, which are only now coming under bigger scrutiny. Scandals in past months have involved most parties and even tainted President Juan Manuel Santos' last campaign. Yet a new study by the Peace and Reconciliation Foundation says the public outcry will not bring political renovation.
There are more than 80 candidates for the Senate and the House of Representatives that have links with criminal organisations or are involved in corruption scandals such as Odebrecht, or are children or wives of currently jailed representatives, all with excellent chances of being elected.
They represent rural family clans that have for decades run their districts like...
So what he's saying is the people candidates, which FARC would be the epitome of, since the ELN can't, that their people are in jail. You know, Al Jazeera doesn't go into a lot of detail about that, but I think I will look it up, and we will see the other side of all of this. So one of my main points about this segment is beware of Al Jazeera. You know, I support them a lot. I show a lot of their videos. I'm not going to show this one. I'm not going to show any of their videos about Venezuela, because they're all bullshit. They're all bullshit. And why Al Jazeera, Qatari, outlet would support thugs and dictators in South America, I have no idea. It's got to either be money or racism. I have no idea which one it is. So we'll finish this out, I guess, and I'll get on to some more important things about South America, which I think is a key news subject for progressives. I think that progressives, just like Bernie used to go down in the 70s and visit Nicaragua. Nicaragua was another one of those countries, and we never hear about it, except for people, American outlets that constantly want to say Noriega, or not Noriega, whatever, the Sandinista guy, and the Sandinistas, that they're all corrupt, right? Anyway, so let's finish this out, and I'll get on to some other stuff about South America to point out my side, because this isn't going to do it.
Most are expected to remain in power, doling out jobs, public work contracts, or just a little food and money to maintain the loyalty of their impoverished voters.
Many politicians enter these corruption circuits to finance their campaigns. They buy out local community leaders and pay around $18 per vote. The culprits in the end are the citizens. They vote for the same corrupt parties, then they complain about corruption. It's a vicious cycle. You can't vote for bandits and then expect to be well governed.
According to the study, only 3 of the 9 main political parties have not presented candidates viewed with suspicion for their relations with illicit activities or criminal organizations, which have many here worrying that the new Congress will have a hard time changing long-standing corruption practices. Juanita León, director of political website La Silla Vacía, says the system is pervasive.
I have done like an informal survey with professional politicians, asking them, okay, how...
So, I mean, this is obviously done by a white Colombian, and they talk about corruption, but they don't really mention that this has got to do with a long-time white government, all white government officials who are there illegally, who are tied to drug, cocaine, and pot. Not so much pot, but cocaine for sure, and corruption to keep themselves in power, right? They just don't want to get into that. They want to hammer away at corrupt, hoping that it'll stick to the indigenous people. Well, you have to get power to be corrupt. You have to be in power to be corrupt, and the indigenous people haven't had a chance to do that yet. So they're just bullshitting, right? I mean, it's just another one of those cases where you can easily figure this out through logic. If you don't own a plane, you can't drop a bomb. When you hear these stories about, they bombed their own people. Well, they don't have any planes. Well, you can't rig elections if you're not powerful politicians.
What is the percentage of patronage versus opinion votes for Congress? And they all agree that is 70% patronage, 30% opinion votes.
Colombia, unlike other major Latin American countries, jailed many clan chieftains, yet the clans remain tough to dislodge as long as votes can be bought for pennies.
So this is all bullshit. They're calling them clans. They're just rich families, is what they're really trying to say. And while they're saying they're clans, they're showing pictures of indigenous people. They're not the ones, If any of them are, then they're just bought off by... And they're not explaining that. They're not explaining that any of the corrupt indigenous people are simply working for, it's the same old capitalist bullshit, right? They just hire frontmen. And out of any group of people, I mean, I can go out right now and hire black people to represent the KKK. I mean, there's always somebody who will do it, right? Americans, everybody around the world needs to get smart, needs to get hip. That's why we were called hippies when we were kids, because we were hip to the truth, the reality. Starting today, I'm a candidate for the presidency of the Republic. And by the way, this was January 20th, I believe. Representing my party, the Common Alternative Revolutionary Force, FARC. I commit myself to lead that transitional government that will generate the conditions for the birth of a new Colombia. And God, does there need to be a birth? A government that will finally represent the interests of the poor in Colombia. Now, I did not see one stone thrown or him being pelted with rocks and tomatoes and stuff. So there's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's a bunch of bullshit, man. The Al Jazeera. I mean, sure, the asshole capitalists in Colombia probably got together and paid a bunch of people to throw stuff at them. They probably have videos. I'm sure that they took videos so that they could show the FARC guy being pelted with stones or fruits and vegetables and eggs and stuff. Anybody can figure that out, right? But, he said it himself. He's going to form a government that is going to represent the poor. I think the scumbag rich drug dealers realize that the country can't forever pretend to support them, and that they can't generate what they need. That people, word of mouth, it just gets around. It's just like in the United States. The government, the establishment was sure that they could keep Bernie from getting out. But, word gets around, man. And I'm not saying Bernie's the best, but because he has too many establishment ties, he has a place in his heart for them, and that's not good. I'll put this, because I couldn't find anything on YouTube. I'll try again, see if I can find anything. But I'll put this in voice. I'll translate it into voice synthesis so you can listen to it rather than have to listen to me try to read it, because I don't even want to become a guy who is good at reading stuff aloud. I'm sorry. I'm not that bad at it, but who wants to sit there and read it aloud when you got a computer that can just read it for you? So I'll put that, and I'll have another quick look on YouTube for anything about this. Sorry. These cams are hard to hold on to. Not really meant to be used like this. So anyway, I found these two Well, I found a bunch, but I will put both of these as links right behind this segment in case you don't understand how I'm doing this now. I'll quickly explain. I have a playlist in Democratic Party headquarters news. That's my, that's what I'm doing all this stuff under. And in there you'll find a playlist that's called Democratic Party Headquarters News Segments, and it's in order of uploads. But I can also, beyond the uploads, like I'll upload this, I can also put in links to stuff like this. So, and I'm going to start also uploading a segment or putting it as part of the playlist so that it has like when I'm used to make the news, I used to put in segues, and of course the introduction at the beginning of the news. And I'm going to take that and slip them in, and it'll almost be like the old news that I used to put together. I just don't have the computer or the time to do that right now, so I'm doing it this way on YouTube. And that'll be it for this segment. Stated what I'm trying to point out here, just as a final comment on this Colombia thing, is that the Colombian government is evil, and it's supported by evil people in the United States, the Bush types, and I'm not saying every Bush or every whoever, the capitalist conservatives in the United States. I'm not saying they're all in on this, but some of them obviously are, and that the Colombian government is evil, and they've just been waging war against their own people because the people are hip to, they're evil, and so they're fighting back. Just the same old, and that they'll do anything if they can get away with it, or they think they can get away with it. It's the ELN and the FARC who've been trying to keep them from getting away with it. Murder, torture, what have you. Death squads. And I'll show you a little bit about that, and I just think, I don't think they're going to stop. I think that they're just using peace processes, attempted peace negotiations to try and bring the FARC out in the open where they can kill them. That's my opinion. I don't know how true it is, but to bring rebels out in the open where they can kill them, for sure. I think that's all that this is about, just to bring them out in the open and to attempt to find weaknesses through strategic means, creating negotiations, whatever. Just all kinds of, anything they can think of to kill these guys. Because obviously they're still killing them, and you'll see in this stuff that I put in.
Death stalks Colombia's unions since 1986. More than 2,800 labor leaders and union members have been killed in Colombia. In recent years, this South American nation has led the world in this grim statistic. And more than 9 out of 10 of these cases remained unsolved. Colombia's failure to protect workers was a key reason for the 5-year delay in U.S. congressional approval of a free trade agreement with it. It was finally approved in 2011. Amid protests from human rights and labor groups, U.S. officials said Colombia had taken steps to protect workers and their labor rights. Unions, human rights activists and others say the abuses and dangers persist, and in some cases have grown. As a result of attacks on unions and other pressures, the percentage of unionized workers in Colombia has dropped from 15% 20 years ago to about 4% today. Teachers have suffered along with others largely because they were seen as social activists and community organizers. The dangers faced by union members and human rights activists mirror a long-lasting vortex of violence propelled by guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, drug cartels, criminals, and, according to human rights groups and others, military and government officials as well. The State Department's 2013 report on human rights in Colombia described the nation plagued by an inefficient judiciary and corruption that limit its ability to prosecute human rights violators. Colombia's unions since 1986. More than 2,800 labor leaders and union members have been killed in Colombia. In recent years, this South American nation has led the world in this grim statistic, and more than 9 out of 10 of these cases remained unsolved. Colombia's failure to protect workers was a key reason for the 5-year delay in U.S. congressional approval of a free trade agreement with it. It was finally approved in 2011. Amid protests from human rights and labor groups, U.S. officials said Colombia had taken steps to protect workers and their labor rights. Unions, human rights activists and others say the abuses and dangers persist, and in some cases have grown. As a result of attacks on unions and other pressures, the percentage of unionized workers in Colombia has dropped from 15% 20 years ago to about 4% today. Teachers have suffered along with others largely because they were seen as social activists and community organizers. The dangers faced by union members and human rights activists mirror a long-lasting vortex of violence propelled by guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, drug cartels, criminals, and, according to human rights groups and others, military and government officials as well. The State Department's 2013 report on human rights in Colombia described the nation plagued by an inefficient judiciary and corruption that limit its ability to prosecute human rights violators.